We now have Nia's skull, a complete and well-preserved piece of history. From this skull, scientists are reconstructing her face, bringing back the image of a girl who lived more than 12,000 years ago. Skeletons don't lie, and in the dark hidden caves of Mexico, one such skeleton has completely changed the way we look at the history of the Americas. This is not just any skull, it is proof of a human life from an age most thought unreachable. The site where Nia was found had remained untouched since between 13 and 12,000 years ago, sealed in darkness, hidden from the world until modern science uncovered it. The girl was young, only a teenager, trapped forever in a lightless abyss. Around her bones, scientists even discovered signs of extinct creatures that once roamed the Ice Age landscape. This discovery is not just another archaeological find, it is one of the most important burials ever uncovered, holding secrets many thought impossible to reveal. Nia's skeleton is the most complete and oldest one ever found in the Americas. What makes it even more extraordinary is that her DNA was still intact. This allowed researchers to prove something that had long been debated, a direct genetic connection between the earliest humans in the Americas and modern Native American populations. When her DNA was studied, it showed unmistakable links to both ancient and present-day indigenous peoples. This discovery confirmed that Nia was part of the first wave of humans who crossed into the Americas thousands of years ago. Her body and her DNA are proof of a shared heritage, a living connection stretching across centuries. The story of how she was found is just as fascinating as what she represents. In 2007, a group of expert divers began exploring the vast underwater caves in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. The cave system is called Sac-Actin, a maze of submerged tunnels that stretches for miles beneath the ground. At first, the divers were simply mapping these tunnels, but then they reached a place unlike anything they had seen before. It was a massive chamber, so dark and so deep they named it Hoyo Negro, which means black hole. Standing at the edge of this pit was like looking into a sunken universe, a world untouched since the Ice Age. At the bottom, about 130 feet below sea level, they saw something extraordinary. Resting in the silence was the nearly complete skeleton of a young girl. Her bones were lying among the remains of giant Ice Age animals, creatures that had long since gone extinct. The preservation was so perfect it seemed as if time itself had stopped. This girl would later be given the name Nia, inspired by water nymphs of ancient mythology, but unlike myth, her story was real, written in her bones and DNA. Nia's skeleton was nearly whole, something extremely rare in archaeology. Out of the 206 bones in the human body, 98 were present, along with 30 teeth. Her skull was intact, her arms and legs still recognizable, even her pelvis preserved. For scientists, this was a treasure beyond imagination. Normally, archaeologists find fragments, pieces of bones or a partial skull, but with Nia, they had almost everything. This made it possible to study her life in detail, from her facial features to her genetic history. But who was she, and how did she end up in that dark pit so long ago? Scientists believe Nia was around 16 years old when she died. During the Ice Age, the Yucatan was not underwater. The caves were dry chambers, open to the surface. It is thought that Nia was exploring or searching for water when she accidentally fell into the deep pit. The fall was fatal, trapping her body where no one could reach. Over thousands of years, as the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, the caves flooded, sealing her remains in water and preserving them in remarkable condition. Nia's discovery has helped answer one of the biggest questions in history: who were the first people in the Americas? For years, scientists debated whether the earliest humans came from Europe, Asia, or some other place. Nia's DNA provided a clear answer. Her genetic markers show strong ties to Asian populations who crossed the Bering Land Bridge, an ice-covered route that once connected Siberia to Alaska. This means that Nia and her people were part of the first wave of migration into the Americas, the ancestors of today's Native American communities. For archaeologists, this was groundbreaking. Before Nia, there was little solid evidence connecting ancient skeletons in the Americas to modern indigenous peoples. Many remains were too incomplete, too damaged, or lacked DNA that could be tested. Nia's skeleton, however, was different. She was the missing piece of a puzzle, the bridge between the prehistoric world and the present. Her DNA proved that Native Americans are directly linked to the first humans who set foot on this land. The discovery also highlighted how much we still don't know about the ancient Americas. Finding a complete skeleton this old is rare enough, but finding one so well preserved that DNA can be studied is almost unheard of. Scientists now believe that other caves in the Yucatan may hold more skeletons like Nia's, waiting to be discovered. Each one could reveal more about how the Americas were first populated, how people lived, and how they adapted to a changing world at the end of the Ice Age. Nia's face, reconstructed from her skull, shows a young woman with distinct features that challenge old stereotypes about what the earliest Americans looked like. For a long time, there was a belief that the first people in the Americas might have looked European. Nia's reconstruction shows otherwise. Her features link her more closely to modern Native American populations, proving once again that their ancestry stretches back further than many had realized. Her story is also deeply human. She was just a teenage girl, living in a world filled with giant animals and harsh conditions. She likely belonged to a small group of hunter-gatherers who survived by moving with the seasons, hunting, and gathering food. Her life was cut short, but in death she left behind something extraordinary, a story written in bone, a connection across 12,000 years, and evidence that has reshaped history. The discovery of Nia is not only about science. It is about identity and belonging. For Native communities today, her story is proof of their deep roots in this land. It shows that their ancestors have been here since the very beginning, carrying traditions, knowledge, and resilience through countless generations. Nia's skeleton is more than an artifact, it is a reminder that history is alive within people, carried forward in bloodlines and stories. As divers, scientists, and historians continue to explore Hoyo Negro and other caves like it, Nia remains a symbol of discovery and connection. Her bones, preserved in silence for thousands of years, now speak louder than ever. They tell us where we came from, how humans spread across continents, and how even a single life can change everything we thought we knew. Her story, once lost in darkness, is now shared with the world, reminding us that the past is never truly gone, it waits, hidden, until we are ready to see it. Nia was only about 5 feet tall, and she died when she was just 15 or 16 years old. Her bones tell a painful story about the short and difficult life she lived. One of her forearms showed a spiral fracture, the kind of injury that usually comes from a hard twist or a sudden pull. That injury had healed long before she died, proving she had survived an earlier accident or struggle. But there was also a much more recent injury, a break in her pelvis. Experts believe that this fresh wound is what ultimately ended her life. Some researchers have even suggested that she may have given birth before she died, making her not just a young girl but possibly a mother. To think of a teenage Ice Age mother dying alone in darkness and being forgotten for thousands of years adds an even more tragic weight to her story. Yet, Nia's significance is not only about her body. It is also about the incredible place where she was found. The chamber where she rested cannot be reached without advanced diving technology. Even today, professional divers must use heavy rebreathers and specialized gear to survive the dangerous conditions inside. The environment is so hostile and fragile that it would be impossible to bring her bones out safely without destroying vital evidence. Because of this, scientists digitally mapped the chamber in detail using three-dimensional photogrammetry. This technology created a virtual time capsule of the cave, allowing researchers to study every fragile layer without disturbing it. Imagine building a fossil that exists entirely inside a computer, preserving the exact layout of a place untouched for thousands of years. That is what they achieved with Nia's resting place. Despite the silence of the cave, Nia still had more to say. Her bones weren't the only record of her life. When scientists carefully drilled into one of her molars, they unlocked an even deeper secret, her DNA. Against all odds, her tooth still held onto genetic material that had survived more than 12,000 years in the humid Mexican cave. Normally, DNA breaks down too quickly to last that long in such an environment, so the fact that Nia's molar preserved it was nothing short of extraordinary. This discovery gave her a voice across time, letting her speak through her genes. When the DNA was extracted and sequenced, what researchers uncovered was astonishing. This wasn't just a small trace of genetic information, it was a direct and complete link to living people. Nia's mitochondrial DNA showed that she belonged to haplogroup D1, a maternal lineage that traces back to ancient Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska during the Ice Age. That same lineage is still present today among indigenous peoples across both North and South America. In fact, haplogroup D1 makes up about 10% of all Native American maternal lines. In some regions, such as Chile and Argentina, it rises as high as 29%. This means that Nia's bloodline not only survived but spread widely across the continents. What made this result even more shocking was the location where she was found. Before Nia, no ancient DNA this old had ever been recovered from such a southeastern point in the Americas. Most of the previous samples, especially those over 10,000 years old, came from regions thousands of kilometers away, over 4,000 kilometers to the north. Her discovery stretched the map of human history and migration in the Americas, proving that people carrying these genetic lines had spread much farther and much earlier than scientists had ever confirmed. Nia's existence completely redrew our understanding of early American ancestry. She was living proof that the first peoples had already traveled deep into the continent by 12,000 years ago, reaching as far as the Yucatan Peninsula. Her DNA connected her not only to ancient ancestors from Asia who crossed into the Americas but also to indigenous peoples alive today. That connection turns her from just an archaeological specimen into a real ancestor, a link in the unbroken chain of humanity. Through her injuries, her resting place, and her preserved DNA, Nia tells us a story no history book could. She was a teenage girl, perhaps a mother, who lived and died during the Ice Age. She fell into a chamber that became her tomb, her body protected for millennia by rising seas and darkness. And in the end, her voice was carried forward not in words but in her bones and her genes. By surviving so long in silence, she has given us answers that once seemed impossible to find. The team studying Nia's remains left nothing to chance. They used every modern tool available for analyzing ancient DNA. They performed restriction assays, Sanger sequencing, and high-resolution Illumina reads. They ran multiple tests, in multiple labs, and every single time they got the same result: Nia belonged to haplogroup D1. When critics began to question the data, the researchers didn't try to hide anything. Instead, they released their findings to public databases, inviting other scientists to check, challenge, or confirm the results. And that's exactly what happened. Other labs tested the data and confirmed it. The evidence was solid. There's a fascinating detail about mitochondrial DNA: it only follows the maternal line. That means it traces your ancestry through your mother, your grandmother, and so on. If your grandmother carried haplogroup D1, you do too. This makes Nia more than just an ancient skeleton. She's part of a living lineage, a thread that stretches directly into the present day. She isn't just a point of data for scientists to study, she's someone's ancestor, connected to countless people alive now across the Americas. But there's another twist, and it's not hidden in the genes, it's in the skull itself. Nia didn't look the way most people would expect. For decades, skeletons of early Americans puzzled scientists because their skull shapes didn't match what we see in today's indigenous populations. These ancient skulls were often long and narrow, with features that seemed closer to Polynesian or Australo-Melanesian populations than to modern Native Americans. This visual difference sparked a storm of theories. Some researchers believed there had been two separate migrations into the Americas. Others suggested the so-called Solutrean hypothesis, which claimed that Ice Age Europeans had crossed the Atlantic to settle the New World thousands of years before Columbus. Nia's remains turned all of that upside down. She had that same Paleo-American skull shape, long and narrow with features that didn't look like modern Native Americans. Yet her DNA was not European, Polynesian, or anything exotic. It was unmistakably haplogroup D1, a direct maternal link to Native Americans living today. This single fact destroyed the assumption that a different skull shape must mean a different origin. Instead, it showed something far simpler and more scientific: bone shapes evolve. Diet, isolation, and genetic drift, All the pressures of life over thousands of years reshape faces and skulls over time. As people adapt to new environments and new lifestyles, their physical appearance changes even if their genetic roots remain the same. Other studies backed up Nia's evidence. Crania from South America showed a range of variation in shape, but it was variation that fit perfectly within normal patterns of evolution, not some mysterious lost tribe from Europe or Oceania. When genetics and morphology clashed, it wasn't the DNA that broke under scrutiny. It was the assumptions. The Solutrean hypothesis, already weak, took another heavy blow. The tools used by Ice Age Europeans and those of the earliest Americans weren't actually identical. The timelines didn't line up. And most importantly, no Ice Age European DNA has ever been found in ancient American remains, not a single trace. That's why most experts now call the Solutrean idea what it really is, fringe speculation dressed up as science. Nia's discovery has given us a new bottom line. The skull may look different, but the bloodline is the same. Ancient Americans and modern Native Americans are connected directly, regardless of how their faces appeared. The differences are simply the product of thousands of years of environmental pressures and evolution, not evidence of separate migrations from distant continents. And Nia isn't alone. Another discovery, the Clovis child, serves as a second voice confirming the same lineage. Found in Montana and dating back about 12,600 years, the Clovis child's DNA also belongs to a lineage directly tied to Native Americans today. Together, Nia and the Clovis child stand as powerful proof that the first peoples of the Americas were the ancestors of today's indigenous communities. They show us that genetics holds the true story, even when our eyes or old theories suggest something else. Through Nia's bones, her DNA, and the careful work of scientists who refuse to take shortcuts, we now have a clearer understanding of the earliest Americans than ever before. Her skull shape may have challenged expectations, but her genetic code spoke louder than appearances, overturning decades of speculation and bringing us closer to the real story of how the Americas were first populated. Nia's story, combined with the Clovis child and other ancient remains, shows us a single, unbroken thread, one people, migrating, adapting, and surviving, from the Ice Age to the present. Travel northeast from where Nia rested in the caves of Mexico and the story picks up again, this time in Montana. There, nearly 12,700 years ago, another child was laid to rest. In a shallow sandstone alcove near the town of Wilsall, a young boy was buried with care and ceremony. His small body was surrounded by more than 100 finely made stone tools, all sprinkled with red ochre, a vivid mineral powder often used in rituals. This same practice of red ochre burials has been seen across Ice Age Eurasia and also in the earliest Americas, connecting traditions across continents. The site became known as Anzac, and the boy himself came to be called Anzac I. Like Nia, he carried secrets locked in his bones, secrets that would only be revealed thousands of years later through the science of DNA. When researchers sequenced his full genome, what they found carried enormous weight. The boy wasn't just similar to Native Americans, he was family. His mitochondrial DNA belonged to haplogroup D4H3A, and his Y chromosome came from QL54, a paternal line that is still common among indigenous men today. This meant his ancestry wasn't lost to time. It was alive and present in the people walking the land today. Even more surprising was where his DNA showed stronger connections. Instead of being most closely tied to northern native groups, his genome leaned towards Central and South American populations. That meant something crucial. By the time Anzac I lived, diversity was already present across the Americas. Different lineages had begun branching, mixing, and spreading in every direction. These weren't just fresh arrivals tentatively making their way south, they were already becoming a rich, varied people with roots deep in the land. Just like with Nia, there was also a Siberian signal in his DNA. Geneticists traced it back to an ancient population in what is now Russia, known as the Malta people. This connection proved that mixing between ancestral groups had already happened long before they reached the Americas. The roots of indigenous peoples were complex and layered even before they set foot in the New World. When the research was complete, something rare happened in science: closure. The bones of Anzac I were returned. In June 2014, tribal leaders and scientists came together for a reburial ceremony near his original resting place. It was a powerful moment of respect, honoring both scientific discovery and cultural tradition. For many, it was a bridge between ancient ancestors and living descendants, showing that the child's story belonged not just to history books but to the people of the land. With Nia and Anzac I, the story of the first Americans began to take a clearer shape. Nia revealed the link. Anzac I confirmed it. But one question still lingered: how did their ancestors travel so far, so quickly, and from where did they come? The answer lies in a place now drowned by the sea, Beringia. Long ago, during the Ice Age, this vast stretch of land connected Siberia and Alaska. Genetic clues suggest that the ancestors of Native Americans did not simply cross it in a rush. Instead, they lived there in isolation for thousands of years. Scientists call this period the Beringian standstill. During that long pause, key genetic lineages, A2, B2, C1, D1, and X2A, formed and stabilized. These would become the founding maternal lines carried by the first peoples of the Americas. But the world was changing. As the climate warmed, glaciers melted, sea levels rose, and new routes opened. When the time was finally right, the people of Beringia moved. And they moved quickly. For a long time, archaeologists believe they came south through an inland ice-free corridor that opened up between the massive glaciers. But new research showed that corridor didn't become a habitable, biologically rich passage until after 12,600 years ago. By that time, people were already living far to the south. The timeline didn't fit. So researchers looked west, to the sea. Along the Pacific Rim stretched what is now called the Kelp Highway. It wasn't a paved road but a natural corridor of life. The coastlines were lined with kelp forests, tidal zones rich with shellfish, waters full of salmon, and shores where game could be hunted. For small groups of people skilled with boats and adapted to coastal life, this route would have been ideal. They could hug the shoreline, move steadily south, and even island hop, thriving on what the ocean provided. This Kelp Highway theory explains a lot. It accounts for how humans reached the Americas so early and spread so widely. It also explains why evidence of the very first coastal sites is so hard to find. As sea levels rose after the Ice Age, many of those ancient settlements were swallowed by the ocean, leaving only faint traces for us to uncover. Through Nia in Mexico and Anzac I in Montana, the story of the first Americans comes into sharper focus. Their DNA, their burials, and their connections to both distant ancestors and modern indigenous peoples reveal a migration story shaped by survival, adaptation, and resilience. From the frozen standstill of Beringia to the kelp-lined shores of the Pacific, the first peoples of the Americas carved out their place in a changing world, leaving behind whispers in bone and blood that still speak to us today. That shift changes the way we picture the first people in the Americas. They weren't just hunters chasing mammoths across open plains. They were also shoreline travelers, skilled at reading tides, navigating rocky coves, and living off what the ocean gave them: fish, shellfish, kelp forests, and seabirds. Ancient genomes back this up, showing a rapid spread of populations followed by gradual regional differences. The diversity seen in places as far apart as the Yucatan Peninsula, where Nia lived, and Montana, where Anzac I was buried, all fits this picture. But then there's another site in Mexico that claims to push the timeline back even further than Nia or Anzac I. If true, it would completely rewrite history. The problem? The evidence is controversial. This place is known as Chicua White Cave, high in the El Hierro Mountains of central Mexico. It exploded into headlines in 2020 when researchers announced findings that, if correct, doubled the timeline of human settlement in the Americas. The team reported thousands of green and black stone flakes from deep layers of sediment. The dating on these layers stretched as far back as 33,000 to 31,000 years ago, nearly 20,000 years earlier than Nia or Anzac I. If humans were really there that long ago, it would mean people reached the Americas during the height of the last ice age, long before the Bering Land Bridge migration most scientists accept today. At first glance, the case looked strong. The greenish stone used for the flakes wasn't local to the cave. Some experts argued that meant people had intentionally brought it there, perhaps because they liked its color or because it was good for toolmaking. Over 90% of the finds were these flakes, and when combined with dozens of radiocarbon and luminescence dates, the timeline appeared convincing. The researchers described them as stone tools, evidence of human craftsmanship and activity deep inside the cave. But not everyone agreed. A large group of critics responded with strong doubts. They studied the shapes and fractures of the stones and argued that many of the so-called artifacts weren't tools at all. Instead, they said the pieces were geoacs, naturally broken limestone chunks created by rockfalls and slope movements inside the cave. In other words, nature, not humans, might have made them. This debate grew louder because the site lacked other expected signs of human activity. There were no hearths or fire pits, no butchered animal bones, no storage areas, and no clear evidence of people living there. Another major issue was the DNA. Scientists recovered plenty of sediment DNA from the cave, traces of plants, animals, and the full Ice Age ecosystem that once surrounded it. But they didn't find any human DNA. Without that, it's hard to prove people actually occupied the site. Critics argued that while the cave may have preserved an ancient environment, there was no clear proof that humans had ever set foot inside it 30,000 years ago. The result is a divided field. If Chikwa White Cave truly shows human activity 33,000 years ago, it would overturn everything we thought we knew about when and how the Americas were settled. But without definitive proof, many researchers remain cautious. The site has become one of the most hotly debated discoveries in recent years. Some see it as groundbreaking, others as misleading. For now, it stands as a mystery, a cave filled with intriguing stones, uncertain origins, and a timeline that challenges the entire story of the first Americans. Without bones or clear proof of human presence, many scientists argue that Chikwa White Cave hasn't yet met the burden of evidence. Without fire pits, butchered animal bones, or human DNA, the story remains incomplete. On social media, however, the site took on a life of its own. Some people claimed it was proof of lost tribes or mysterious old world migrations into Mexico, while others treated it as confirmation of fringe theories about humans being in the Americas tens of thousands of years earlier than mainstream science accepts. The truth is far less certain. For now, the cave remains unresolved, a puzzle that hasn't yet given up all its secrets. What's missing is nuclear DNA. Nia's mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from mothers, gave researchers important information about her ancestry, but it tells only one side of the story. To fully understand who she was and how she fit into the family tree of the first Americans, scientists need nuclear DNA. Unlike mitochondrial DNA, nuclear DNA is inherited from both parents. It can reveal whether Nia belonged to the northern or southern branch of Native Americans, whether there were patterns of sex-biased migration, and whether gene flow shaped early populations in complex ways we still don't fully grasp. Nuclear DNA could even help answer long-standing questions such as whether ancient populations in Mexico carried the same faint traces of Australasian-like ancestry that appear in some South American groups like those in the Amazon. The problem is that no nuclear DNA has ever been recovered from Ice Age human remains in Mexico. Not from Nia, not from anyone of her time. Without it, major parts of the story remain blank. But that may be about to change. Researchers are now targeting new parts of the skeleton that preserve DNA much better than ordinary bone. The petrous portion of the inner ear, for example, can hold up to 100 times more usable DNA than other skeletal areas. Tooth roots also offer a promising method. By sampling the cementum, the thin layer covering the roots, scientists can extract genetic material while leaving the overall tooth intact, protecting the specimen's appearance. These methods, combined with single-stranded DNA library preparation designed for damaged and ancient fragments, are raising the chances of success. Momentum is also building from recent breakthroughs. In 2023 and 2024, researchers managed to sequence dozens of pre-Hispanic genomes from younger remains across Mexico. These samples were not Ice Age old, but they still revealed important details, evidence of ritual sacrifice, signs of how people adapted to changing climates, and even genetic continuity between ancient communities and some indigenous groups living in the region today. While fascinating, these results are around 10,000 years too late to resolve the debate about the very first Americans. They add depth to the story of Mexico's ancient peoples but leave the earliest chapters in shadow. That brings the focus back to places like Tulum, where Nia rests, and to other underwater caves along the Yucatan coast. These sites hold a hidden cast of Ice Age lives, preserved in their limestone chambers and submerged cenotes. Each discovery there, whether a skull, a tooth, or a piece of bone, offers a fragile but vital chance to fill the gaps in the story. If nuclear DNA is finally recovered from one of these remains, it could reshape everything we think we know about when, how, and from where the first people entered the Americas. Until then, the mystery remains unsolved, waiting for the science to catch up with the questions. Nia wasn't the only Ice Age person to rest in the flooded caves of the Yucatan. Beneath the limestone corridors, where fresh water once flowed and now only darkness and silence remain, lie several other ancient individuals, preserved against all odds in the tropics where heat and moisture usually erase all traces of the past. One of the oldest is a young woman known as Eva de Nairon, dated to around 13,600 years ago. Her bones were found more than 350 meters deep inside a submerged tunnel. That depth alone makes one thing clear: she didn't simply wander in and get trapped. She went there on purpose, entering the underground world for reasons we can only guess at. Another is La Mujer de las Palmas, dated to about 10,000 years ago. She became famous not just because of her age but because of her face. Scientists created a lifelike facial reconstruction that brought her back into the public eye. Suddenly she wasn't just a skeleton in a cave, she was a real woman, someone who once walked, laughed, maybe struggled, and lived in a world very different from ours. Seeing her reconstructed face reminded people that these aren't abstract ancestors, they were humans, with feelings, families, injuries, and stories written into their bones. Then there is the haunting case of Chan Hole 3, discovered in 2016 more than a kilometer from the mouth of the cave and now 8 meters below water. She was about 30 when she died. The way her body was found makes it difficult to dismiss as accidental. Her skull and torso were arranged near a flat slab of limestone that could have been used as a headrest. It wasn't quite a formal burial, but it also wasn't random. Her skeleton reads almost like a medical record. She had 3 healed skull fractures, possible signs of infection, and a distinct cranial shape, a local pattern shared by other Tulum skeletons. For now, those shapes tell us more about biology and environment than ancestry because no genome-wide DNA has yet been recovered from her bones. And then there's Chan Hole 2, another individual found in the same network. But this one was looted. Divers stole the remains before scientists could properly study them. That theft is a painful reminder of how fragile and irreplaceable this record is. Every bone in those caves holds clues that could change how we understand the first Americans, yet a single careless act can erase those clues forever. But the caves didn't only preserve human remains. In the same pitch-black tunnels that held these Ice Age skeletons, researchers uncovered something even more unexpected: evidence of mining. Not modern mining, but deliberate, organized excavation done by Paleo-Indians between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, deep inside what is now known as the Sagittario Cave System. In 2020, archaeologists mapped out chambers like La Mina, and what they found erased any doubt. This was the oldest known underground industry in the Americas. The miners worked with purpose. They carved and extracted a type of mineral pigment called ochre, red, yellow, and orange powders that were highly valued in the Ice Age world. Ochre was used for many things: ritual burials, body paint, cave art, even as a practical substance for tanning hides and protecting skin. The people who ventured into those caves didn't stumble around blindly. They carried torches, broke rock systematically, and left behind pits, hammerstones, and trails that showed organized labor. These operations went on for thousands of years, generation after generation of miners descending into total darkness with only firelight to guide them. Think about what that means. While mammoth hunters roamed the plains above, another group of people descended into the underworld to gather a resource that mattered deeply to their culture. They navigated treacherous tunnels, squeezed through narrow passages, and dug in silence, all to bring back ochre that would be used in ceremonies, on tools, and perhaps even in art and healing. This wasn't just survival. This was culture, ritual, and belief guiding action. It proves that Ice Age people of the Americas were not only resourceful hunters but also miners, craftspeople, and spiritual thinkers. These finds connect directly to the skeletons in the same caves. Many of those bodies, including Nia and others, were dusted with ochre in death. It seems almost certain that the pigment pulled from those very caves ended up being part of burial rituals, linking the living and the dead through a shared substance of deep symbolic meaning. In that sense, the miners of Sagittario weren't just laborers. They were participating in one of humanity's oldest traditions, turning the earth itself into a tool for memory, expression, and survival. The ochre mines hidden deep inside the Sagittario caves were nothing like random scrapes in the rock. They were carefully planned workspaces. Archaeologists found pits carved straight into the cave floor, stalagmites broken down and reshaped into hammers, cairns of stones stacked to act as trail markers, and piles of spoil neatly left behind after ore was dug out. Torches made from resin-rich wood were found exactly where they had burned out thousands of years ago, their blackened remains still resting in the silence. These were not ritual sites or accidents. They were workshops, purpose-built zones where people carved into the earth for one specific resource. Documenting it all was a massive effort. Divers logged more than 600 hours underwater and took tens of thousands of photographs. They built full three-dimensional reconstructions of the tunnels so every detail could be studied without disturbing the fragile sediments. This work allowed scientists to virtually walk through an Ice Age mine frozen in time, untouched since it was abandoned and later swallowed by rising seas. But the question still lingers: why? Why would ancient people risk their lives and their breath in total darkness for red powder? The answer is that ochre wasn't just pigment, it was a survival tool, a kind of prehistoric Swiss Army knife. Indigenous peoples used ochre for many practical and symbolic purposes. It helped preserve animal hides, acted as an adhesive, worked as a form of sunscreen and insect repellent, and was even used for wound care. It also held sacred value, appearing as body paint in ceremonies and burials. And these miners weren't just scraping dust from the walls. They specifically sought out high-purity hematite deposits that produced a rich, buttery pigment prized for its quality. Similar ochre has been found across continents, showing its wide cultural importance. The discovery changes the way we think about the first Americans. They weren't only hunters roaming in search of food. They were also underground engineers, carefully extracting a resource that carried both practical and spiritual meaning. Generation after generation, they returned to the caves, harvesting color from the veins of the earth. It paints a picture of people who shaped their environment with purpose, not just survival instinct. But long before Nia walked into Hoyo Negro, before Chanhol's skeletons were laid to rest, and before Paleo-Indians mined ochre in the Sagittario system, the stage for all of this had already been set by a catastrophe millions of years earlier. Around 66 million years ago, a massive asteroid slammed into what is now northern Yucatan. The impact left behind a crater about 180 kilometers wide, an event known today as the Chicxulub impact. That explosion ended the age of dinosaurs, wiping out nearly 3/4 of all life on Earth. But it also reshaped the land in ways that would eventually affect human history. The force of the impact fractured the limestone crust of the peninsula, breaking it into a honeycomb of cracks and voids. Over time, rainwater seeped through, dissolving rock and collapsing ceilings to create sinkholes and caves. These sinkholes, called cenotes, became vital lifelines in a dry region almost completely lacking rivers. They collected fresh water, attracted animals, and drew in humans. From space today, you can still see the outline of the buried crater, marked by a ring of cenotes that trace its rim like a dotted scar circling the land. Fast forward to the Ice Age, and these cenotes were more than just watering holes. They became traps, archives, and sacred places. Megafauna came to drink and sometimes fell in. People ventured down, whether to mine ochre, bury their dead, or perhaps perform rituals we may never fully understand. In the case of Hoyo Negro, the giant cavern where Nia was found, it became both a tomb and a time capsule. Even though it lies east of Chicxulub's main rim, it connects to the same aquifer shaped by that ancient impact. In other words, the very disaster that killed the dinosaurs also created the hidden tunnels that would one day preserve the story of Ice Age humans. And the scale of this network is staggering. In 2018, divers connected Sac Acton and Dos Ojos, briefly making it the longest underwater cave system ever recorded. These endless, water-filled corridors hold more than just geological beauty. They contain ochre mines, Ice Age skeletons, extinct animals, and evidence of the earliest people to live in the Americas. They are living archives born out of an extinction event and kept safe beneath the earth for tens of thousands of years. So in the end, the caves of the Yucatan aren't just natural wonders. They are intersections of two timelines, one that began with an asteroid ending the reign of the dinosaurs, and another that began when humans stepped into the darkness carrying torches, tools, and ochre-stained hands. Every discovery pulled from these tunnels rewrites our understanding of where we came from, and each skeleton or pigment pit is a reminder that history is often hidden in the least expected places, waiting in silence until someone dares to dive into the dark and bring it back to light.